ever volunteer with your local chapter for the Red Cross? Good, okay. If you ever want to work for the International Red Cross Red Crescent, you have to be a local chapter volunteer. At that point, as you volunteer, you take all of the different medical training courses and the disaster service management courses that they offer for free. So all of you can go off and do these courses now. And if you're interested in international development, the Red Cross free training courses are considered tremendous skill-based learning, and they're really regarded very well by these international development agencies if they see that on your resume. And this is, we're talking a Saturday afternoon, or maybe at worst a 2-day session over a couple of weekends to get introduction to mass shelter care services, something like that. So you could do some of these things as a volunteer in your local community, and then slowly from there you get on what's called the local registry, which means that if there's a fire at 4 a.m., you've taken some training, you go off and you help that family. Still not necessarily internationally focused. If you've got language skills, though, you register with your local Red Cross chapter as a volunteer, and if that family happens to be a Hispanic family whose English levels may not be strong, particularly when it comes to a family that's dealing with a real crisis at 2 in the morning, you may be called up as a volunteer. And then you'll go in and act as an interpreter, basically, or just provide all the logistics services. You'll just be doing it in your language. Still as a volunteer, still maybe getting called up for 3 or 4 hours once every couple months. It's not a huge time commitment. Once you've done that a few times, you get on the national registry, which means they'll send you anywhere in the United States if you have time and interest and availability when there's a major health or disaster crisis. And as you do that, you can go on the international chapter. So if there's a major mudslide in Guatemala, boom, you're down there for 2 weeks, depending on your availability. So there's a lot of flexibility, but it can really give you a flavor or a sample. And it all starts off with, a Saturday afternoon of volunteering to take a course. It's not a lot of commitment. World Affairs Councils are great. Most major cities have WACs, World Affairs Councils. Go to meet some people, go talk to some folks. Say, what is it that you do? Oh, you work for a private company. Well, how is your work internationally related? I mean, this is just a way to test the water. You're not making decisions yet about where you're going or who you're working for. It's to get a better understanding of, is this the right kind of field for me? And if so, what do I do? As you get to know people, ask them those kind of questions. Well, where did you go to school? What kind of education do you have? What kind of education do the people you hire have? Here's my kind of education. How far or how close am I to your interests or background? And if they start laughing, okay, make your cell phone ring and leave. But they won't usually do that. But you want to make sure that you're getting information from the people. These are the folks that do this kind of work. So, and you're always going to hear different information. Oh, we only hire MBAs. We only hire people with this degree. Well, remember that the "we only" is one person's opinion. So don't base your entire next 20 years of what you need to do or re-educate yourself on it. One "we only," but it's a starting point for information. Okay, languages. Russian speakers. How many of you, okay, hands up, Russian speakers. I'm not picking on the Russian speakers. All right. How many of you would be interested in a career in international development? Whatever that might mean to you. Okay. Here's a pro and here's a con to having Russian. And again, this is a generalization. In general, most of the big international development organizations, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, Child Reach, Plan International, Catholic Relief Services, all of those big groups, most of them have a requirement of French, Spanish, or Portuguese as a language requirement. Now that's not to say they're going to say, great, and it's Tajikistan for you, but what they're saying is with one of those 3 languages, you allow us as an employee to send you to a larger number of locations potentially than somebody who doesn't have one of those languages. So if your love for a particular language, Russian, German, whatever that language, Japanese, Chinese, whatever that is, it's not to say don't continue to study that language, but recognize that in some professional fields, there may be language requirements. How many of you might ever be interested in working for the UN? Okay, you already have done some internships or consultancies with them. There are 6 UN languages. English is one of them. You must have at least one other UN language to be employed officially at the UN. Now, there's always exceptions to the UN. You certainly discovered that being in Geneva because that is exception central. But in general, in paperwork, officially, the requirements are based on citizenship and based on language. And if you want to be an interpreter or a translator, you have to have 3 languages. And we're not talking, I can order a meal and get a taxi cab language level. We're talking native proficiency levels. So again, think about those. The 6 UN languages are Russian, French, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, and English. So English is always going to be one, and you've got to have another one. So if that's a goal for you in the future, how close or how far are you with that? Yes?
Outside of UN, like just interpreting for a firm.
Yes.
Going from the language that you studied into English. What are the credentials that you need?
Yeah, good question. We're going to cover a little bit on translating and interpreting in a second here. It's really going to vary from organization to organization. Some of them will ask for international credentials, which could include things like the ATA, the American Translators Association. They could include advanced degrees in language levels. There's actually schools that have, master's degrees, or there aren't any schools that do PhDs in translation and interpretation. The terminal degree is an MA level. The Institute has one of those, for example. There's 2 good schools in Europe. One is in France and one is in, I want to say Switzerland. What's that? Is it the? Yes, sorry.
Switzerland.
Yes. There's not a lot of schools that do accredited, recognized international, translation interpretation degrees. Usually what most companies, at least in the private sector, are going to say is you've got to have a native proficiency or be a native speaker of that language. Usually when you're hired as a translator or interpreter, it's going from what's called A language, your native language, into B language, your non-native language, versus going from non-native into native. So, you're going to have to really demonstrate a very proven fluency in that language. And fluency is not as high as near native or native proficiency. So, when we grade languages, for example, at the Monterey Institute, it's beginner, intermediate, advanced, fluent, near native, or native. And what's the difference between fluent and near native? Fluent means you've got a good grasp of the language and you can function. Near native means if you and I had a conversation, maybe once in a blue moon, you might just say something that makes me go, is she a native speaker or not? But I'm not really sure. I mean, your level is so high that you could be a native speaker. We're just not really 100% sure. So that's just a very rough example of it. You're going to have proven experience usually in the private sector on very specific terminology, because one of the challenges, certainly with interpreting, is that you have to know the terminology of your field. So going off and being a medical interpreter, if you can't say, electroencephalocardio something, if you can't actually speak the terminology, it's going to be next to impossible to be a medical interpreter. Court interpreting, same thing. So most interpreters actually define a particular field that they've got a knowledge of, and then they build a technical terminology base for that, and then they actually work in that specific field. There's also simultaneous and consecutive interpreting, and I don't know if you guys know the difference. Okay, so I'll explain that. So again, you'll usually become one or the other. There's also conference interpreters. There's what we call traveling interpreters that really go to locations with a particular group. In the private sector, Toyota, for example, they have what's called in-house traveling interpreters, where when constituent groups come from the headquarters in Tokyo, they bring interpreters with them as they travel to different regional offices wherever their facilities are based. So the interpreters travel with the team of visiting delegates. So it's a very different environment in that sense for the private sector. So it's not so much that you have to pass a certain exam, because that doesn't really exist in the interpreting world yet, but it's really looking at your experience, your credentials. It's not just that you have solid language skills, it's proof that you can use that in a very specific setting. Yes?
Sorry, if you're a beginner or intermediate, what's the best possible way to quickly advance? Other than taking classes and field experience, what would you suggest?
Well, I'm glad you bring up the field experience. Most of those big international development organizations that I mentioned also require a minimum of 6 months of in-country time. And they won't look at you unless you've got that time. Why? For want of another word, they're scared that you're going to freak out the first time the power's off for 7 days, or you come down with malaria, or whatever challenging situation that doesn't exist, where you're currently located happens, that you're going to have a comfort level to adapt to that. So they want to see that type of experience. I'm not a linguist by any means, and I say I'm living proof that, that God bless the poor professor that had me at the Monterey Institute for Language. Somehow we decided I was going to squeak through, so I'm not going to answer language questions. Hi there. What are you doing in Middlebury?
Saying hi to you.
Well, hi. We'll have to talk later. This is one of my illustrious students. I would defer your question to the experts, first of all. But in general, what a lot of people will say is you've got to physically be in that environment, because it's not just acquiring language, it's acquiring the nuances of the language. I'm a firm believer when you go to, Paris to learn French, but you hang out with all the Americans and the Australians from 5 to 9 and on the weekends, your French skills are going to be mediocre. Because other than when you're in class, and as you've discovered here, because you have to speak the language from morning, noon, and night, you have no choice. So your language automatically increases. But that's a pretty unusual environment. Most people, when they go to another country to work on language skills, find themselves chumming around in their social or personal time, or if they're in the office, like, oh great, I'm going to be living in, I'm going to be living in Moscow, I'm going to speak Russian all day. But everybody in the office speaks English.